Yeah. Hold on one second.
Leave us unhurt, that is torn and battered. The ruling generation's gotta wake up now. And our generation gonna show you how. Why are you sleeping? Why are you so blind? When I look around, I think you lost your mind. How can you diss the earth this way? She gives us our life each and every day. But you spit on her and you ask for more without thinking what future generations will endure. Who will be left by the time you are done? Your children will suffer from your dysfunction. So live as if our future matters. Don't leave us on earth that is torn and battered. The ruling generation's gotta wake up now. And our generation gonna show you how.
The air is so polluted, getting hard to breathe. Forced to spring, now means no more trees. Water is rising in the sea.
You unleash the storm because of your disease.
Warning bells are ringing, you better take heed. Destroying the earth
with your greed.
Storm is coming, you better beware.
What you're leaving us children just ain't fair. So live as if our future matters. Don't leave us on earth that is torn and battered. The ruling generation's gotta wake up now. And our generation's gonna show you how.
Youth are uniting
along with the planet.
We're not taking our
awesome earth for granted.
We stand together and we're changing the game.
Our movement will go down in history of fame. And all the people who've been fighting for so long are the heroes who have made our revolution strong. United together, our message will be heard and we'll create a world that we deserve. So live as if our future matters. Don't leave us on earth that is torn and battered. The ruling generation's gotta wake up now. And our generation's gonna show you how. Live as if our future matters. Don't leave us on earth that is torn and battered. The ruling generation's gotta wake up now. And our generation's gonna show you how. Live as if our future matters. Live as if our future matters. Live as if our future matters.
Time to tell a story of all that's good. Show the world
we all share the same hood.
We have to protect our united force
and get reconnected to our light source. We're igniting a generation of inspired youth to stand up together and tell us the truth. The people are rising like a wave in the sea to change the direction of our destiny. So live as if our future matters. Don't leave us on earth that is torn and battered. The ruling generation's gotta wake up now. And our generation's gonna show you how. Us on earth that is torn and battered. The ruling generation's gotta wake up now. And our generation's gonna show you how.
It wasn't reported in the daily newspapers, but the shift really did hit the fan. Things have changed. Man's view of his own position in our own local neighborhood and in the universe has changed drastically. We suddenly come face to face with facts. There are loads of planets out there. We used to think our solar system was the only one. There is new technology that we know about that not only can tell us about other solar systems, but that would enable us to go there if we wanted to spend the money. We have to recognize that our technology is primitive. We've had long-distance radio since 1901. the stars in the local neighborhood can be up to millions, billions of years older than the sun. When I talk about star travel, I want to go to Zeta Reticuli, Zeta 1 or Zeta 2 Reticuli. Two stars, constellation of Reticulum, can't see them from here, got to go below the equator. They're only 39.3 light years away from us, which is down the street. However, those two stars are 1 billion years older than the sun, and from each other are only 1/8 of a light year apart. They're 30 times closer to each other than the sun is to the next star over. We're out in the boondocks. Others have next door neighbors and sufficient time to develop better propulsion systems. And when you have a neighboring star that close, you can look for planets much easier. The other stars are visible all day long. That's a whole new ball game. So we've got to reevaluate ourselves. The incredible Kepler space satellite has discovered loads and loads and loads of planets. They're standard, they're normal, they're varied. Our position is not at the top of the heap anymore. And the notion that we have to expect aliens to send us radio signals using technology like ours is absurd. It is clear, if you study technology in any area, that progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. Don't look for people doing the same things we're doing the same way we're doing. Lasers aren't better light bulbs, they're entirely different physics. We've only had them for 52 or so years. And everywhere you look, it's like that. I worked on fission nuclear rockets. They're not just better chemical rockets. The best one, the Los Alamos built, 8 feet in diameter, put out twice the power of Grand Coulee Dam, which is immense, enormous, incredible. One nuclear rocket engine. I worked on fusion rockets. Fusion is what goes on in the sun and in every other star in the universe. Every advanced society is going to know about nuclear fusion. We use it for H-bombs. We're a primitive society. Major activity is tribal warfare. But fusion will get us to the stars. If you use the right stuff in the right way, it won't be cheap. You kick particles out the back end that have 10 million times as much energy per particle as they can get in the dumb old chemical rocket. 10 million is a big multiplier. Trips to nearby stars are feasible with round-trip times shorter than the average person's lifetime, without violating any of the laws of physics, instead being sharp, clever, forward-looking. I am reminded of the fact that an astronomer, Dr. Campbell, in 1941, he was reading a lot of science fiction about going to the moon and he thought it was absurd. So he published a scientific paper in a philosophical journal to calculate the required initial launch weight of a rocket able to get a man to the moon and back. It's a legitimate question. How big's the darn thing got to be? Pages of equations. Bottom line, it would have to be 1 million tons. We sent 3 guys to the moon and back, still with a dumb old chemical rocket whose initial launch weight was 3,000 tons. He was off a factor of 300 million because he made all the wrong assumptions. He assumed a single-stage rocket, a limit of 1g acceleration, a whole bunch of other stupid assumptions. The rocketry people knew they were stupid assumptions, but he didn't talk to any of them. He knew what was right. He was his great scientist. So much of my life is spent smashing the crazy ideas of the bright people who say stupid things when they don't know what they're talking about. The British Astronomer Royal in 1956. Space travel is utter bilge. Who would pay for it? No good would come of it. What we need is better systems for astronomical research. 1 year later, Sputnik went up, and the field of science that's benefited the most from the space program is astronomy. He was not very accurate. The current British Astronomer Royal, equally ludicrous. Only kooks see UFOs, he said publicly. Basis given? None. Is it true? Absolutely not. Loads of sightings by astronomers. He didn't do his homework. He didn't need to. He knew what the truth was. After all, he was a smart guy, head at the top of the heap. There are loads of examples. I have a book, Science Was Wrong. 14 chapters, each one started by some smart scientist saying something stupid. And it's time for a second volume, really, because there are many examples of this. Arrogance and ignorance seem to go together. So I like to puncture balloons. I like to let people know that their notions are wrong when they are wrong. Some of them have to do with flying saucers. There is no evidence. How many times have I heard that? Well, if you refuse to look at the 5 large-scale scientific studies that I talk about, no, there's no evidence. But they're there. Why not look at them? Governments, I've had, especially academics, say that governments can't keep secrets. Seth Shostak of the SETI Institute gave us 2 examples. He said the proof of that is how FEMA fouled up with Katrina. What in the heck has that got to do with keeping government secrets? That's CIA, DIA, NRO, NSA, these alphabet soup agencies. Black budget estimated at $40 billion a year. That's where the secrets are kept. Another great astronomer, Dr. Tyson, head of the Hayden Planetarium, said in a speech to people at Penn State University, the proof that the government can't keep secrets is how much we know about President Clinton's genitalia. That's absolute nonsense. It's a funny line, I'll give him credit for that. And I use as examples of secrets the Corona spy satellite. Not named after Corona, New Mexico here, but that was the name they gave the satellite. It was our first spy satellite. They had 12 failures in secret. The 13th one was successful. It got more information about Soviet military installations than all the U-2 flights which had preceded it. That was 1960. Now, you'd think they'd have jumped for joy. There was no word in public until 1995. That was an expensive program. And it was of enormous value. We needed to know what the Russians were doing, and they're not telling us, so you got to go and find out. And the U-2 was risky because we were violating, national territory kind of thing. But space is okay. And there's an interesting example. The Russians didn't tell their people about the U-2 flights, super high flights of airplanes, and we used them because the Russians couldn't shoot them down with their planes. The United States, Russians didn't tell their people because they didn't want them to know that they couldn't do anything about it. The United States didn't tell Americans about the U-2 flights because we were violating international law. So both groups were keeping their mouths shut, not because they got together and said, you don't want to talk, no, you don't want to talk, no. They both had their own objectives, in other words. And when Khrushchev's, one of his newfangled experiments, they shot down the U-2, Gary Powers' flight, we lied about it. What else are we going to do? That's right, bad weather, blew the plane off course. Sorry, just weather information. And Khrushchev showed the pilot and the plane and the camera, and at least I got up and said, yes, it's a spy plane, because we need to know what they're doing in a secret place, the Soviet Union. We got surprise attacked once, that's enough, Pearl Harbor. So, cover up, well, Lockheed covered up the stealth aircraft program, 10 years, $10 billion, that's a pretty good sized secret. The NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, they had a contract with Boeing to improve the architecture, the design of these very sophisticated spy satellites that the NRO uses. You can read the license plate in the Kremlin parking lot, that kind of thing. They were trying to improve these. They spent $13 billion and canceled the program because they didn't get what they want. $13 billion, done in secret. That's a lot of people, a lot of time, a lot of money. And there were loads, there were several spy satellites that we operated for years without the public knowing what they were doing. And on the other hand, when we recognized that the Russians were way ahead of us in building small nuclear power plants for use in space, we wound up buying one of them. It was looked at here in New Mexico. The Russians launched over 30 successfully. The United States won. So there's stuff that we're not being told very often. And it's of interest to me. Having worked under security for 14 years, you understand. Nuclear airplanes, nuclear rockets, nuclear power plants for space. I don't even have the final report I wrote on a program entitled Analysis and Evaluation of Fast and Intermediate Reactors for Space Vehicle Applications. One key word was left out, Soviet. I was looking at Russian technical literature, and I correctly predicted they'd be launching these small nuclear reactors. I must have been the only person in the country who was happy when Cosmos 954 crashed up in the middle of nowhere in the Arctic area in northern Canada. And the newspaper coverage always worried about, oh, the caribou are going to get high doses of radiation. Who cared? There's nobody up there. What was important was that meant that the Russians had more energy available to them in their satellites for particle beam weapons, laser weapons, for fancy radar to monitor the skies and the oceans and so forth. None of the newspapers mentioned that. They didn't know. So we're at a time when we need to realize that A, we're not at the top of the heap. We're not the big shots we'd like to think we are. B, that we aren't anywhere as near as advanced as anybody else who's had a few hundred, a few thousand, a few million years to work on it. Progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. Not many people realize we didn't know there was more than one galaxy until 1924, for example. And there are a whole bunch of other things. There were astronomers who in the 19th century said there's one thing they're sure of, they'll never know the composition of the stars. They were wrong. We figured out new instruments to detect exactly that. And so we need a modicum of reduction in our arrogance about ourselves, how important we are, how far we've gone. And there is the presumption, if our smart people don't know how to do it now, it'll never be done. And history tells us that's wrong, over and over and over again. And so maybe we ought to be teaching our children a little humility. I have a great-grandson. I hope when he grows up that we're more aware of all the alien visitors around here and that we stop looking like a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare. That's how I think aliens look upon us. What else can you say? World War II, and I'm old enough to remember, we killed 50 million of our own kind. 50 million. We destroyed 1,700 cities. That's how evil man can be to evil. And this year, we will spend $1 trillion on things military. $1 trillion. And yet, thousands of children die every single day of preventable disease or starvation. So how do we look to another civilization? This is the devil's island of this corner of the galaxy. They dumped all the bad boys and girls here. And they've made a mess of the place. You know, so we need to revise our thinking, get rid of our arrogance, get rid of some of our ignorance, and be aware that there is something to be learned all over the place in everything we're doing. We're not at the ultimate in anything except stupidity, and we don't need any more of that. You know, people ask me, why is it that some scientists are so wrong in what they say about UFOs and a whole bunch of other things? Well, frankly, I've found that there are 4 rules for debunkers of everything. It doesn't matter what you're looking at. It certainly applies to UFOs, medical stuff, all kinds of things. First, don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. Second, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. Third, if you can't attack the data, attack the people. Like the British astronomer Royal said, only kooks see UFOs. Basis given, 0. Is it true? No. If anybody who looks at the evidence, which of course he didn't, would find. Do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble. Nobody will know the difference anyway. And so there are a myriad of examples of all of these things. And it's not just about UFOs at all. I'm a physicist, but I have broad interests. I used to do a weekly science commentary for CBC Radio in Fredericton, New Brunswick, where I live. And boy, there are a lot of examples in published scientific, in quotes, literature of people, smart people saying stupid things. We need to grow up a little bit and get rid of some of the arrogance. We need to start recognizing that we don't know it all. Almost all new discoveries are the result of somebody recognizing something and saying, gee, wonder what's going on here, let's check, rather than I must have made a mistake. And many of the great discoveries of mankind, you know, from penicillin, X-rays, radioactivity, and a whole slew of other things. The first nuclear fission, a guy was bombarding uranium with neutrons and measuring what was the result of that. And he found some atoms that weren't close to uranium on the periodic table. Well, they should be. A couple of units up or down. They worked on it and realized they were way down. That uranium atom had split into two half-size particles, atoms. Fission had taken place. First time. By accident. They weren't expecting that. They were just measuring what happens when you bombard uranium with neutrons. Now, they went after trying to figure out, are there other neutrons produced so that you could have a chain reaction? When you fission the uranium atom, this big monster atom, the heaviest natural atom, and it splits, you get any neutrons out too? Because they could hit another one, and they could hit another one, and wow. And they looked very carefully, and son of a gun, about 2 other neutrons per fission. And we were off to the races with the Manhattan Project to develop nuclear weapons. But it was innocent to begin with. They didn't know that was going to happen. So there's another part of that. People don't realize how much money government's willing to spend in secret. The facility for enriching uranium was built at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. They built a facility a mile long. That's a pretty good sized building, to pump uranium hexafluoride gas through little holes in nickel, and the lighter isotope goes through a little faster. So if you keep doing this, you enrich. You get pretty soon there's more and more uranium-235 instead of that heavy one, U-238. You don't want that one. They used 5% of the electrical power produced in the United States in secret. Nobody knew about it. And that's why it was in Oak Ridge, incidentally. They had Tennessee Valley power plants. 5% of the electrical power of the United States is a lot, you see. And nobody knew about it. Secrets can be kept. And, you know, I get a kick out of people saying, the people involved, I think there was a group called Majestic 12. Well, surely those guys would have told their wives. I worked under security for 14 years. I never told my wife anything classified. You don't. Loose lips sink ships. It's really true. And so governments can keep secrets. And there are loads and loads of multi-billion-dollar programs that have been kept secret. We need to recognize that. I'm not saying it's bad. But those people say, well, this can't be happening or that because we'd know about it. Nonsense is all I can say, as somebody who had a clearance for 14 years. So I'm excited about the opportunity to enlighten people, to make them aware of all aspects of the UFO phenomena and advanced technology and stuff that I've worked on. I was very pleased to work on Westinghouse's nuclear rocket. 7 feet in diameter, power level 1,100 megawatts, half the power of Grand Coulee Dam. It was exciting when the damn thing ran, I'll tell you, and didn't blow apart. We were worried about that. So I've had some exciting moments in my life. And then I've had all the programs that have been canceled, but we don't want to talk about that. It isn't enough to know that secrets have been kept. You need to be willing to spend the money to take the next steps. And it takes people with imagination. And one of the downsides of security is that people who might be able to help you don't know what you're doing, so don't know that they can help. The early work on H-bomb, the astronomers and the physicists weren't talking to each other. And it turned out that the astronomers had published articles, not with the bomb environment at all in mind, but that would have been a direct help to the guys working on the bomb. They weren't talking to each other. So there have been many examples of that. That's the way life is. It's the price you pay. We need people at the top who are smart enough to realize that not everybody needs to know everything. But sometimes some people need to know some other things. So I'm still an optimist. I've been around a long time and I'm still optimistic. We'll come through all this. And my great-grandson will grow up in an environment that is peaceful and more connected with the local galactic neighborhood, I think. We need to be that. First contact is a real problem. You have the simple question, who speaks for planet Earth? I mean, people say, why don't they land on the White House lawn? The President of the United States does not speak for 7 billion Earthlings. And it's a no-fly zone anyway, you know. What we need is the people on the planet to talk to each other. And one of the biggest reasons for cover-up No government wants its citizens to owe their allegiance to the planet instead of that individual government. Nationalism's the only game in town. How do we get past that? Now, maybe if there was a terrible thing about to happen on the planet, we'd all work together, you know, and when there's a disaster, sometimes there is some of that. But we have not yet figured out the right way to have the interests of everybody be concerned. And I would like to see an announcement that, yes, the evidence is here that aliens are visiting, and we have called international conferences over the next 3 months dealing with the psychological, religious, economic aspects of this with representatives from many, many countries talking about it. The religious aspects are one. You know, I'm surprised the Pope, the last 2 popes, have made positive comments. God made them just as well, our brethren in outer space, as he made us. Wow, who's been talking to him, you know? What it takes is leadership, and that's something the planet seems to be very shy about. That's what we need. That's, you know, President Roosevelt, there were people who didn't like him and so forth, but he provided leadership for the nation in a time of trouble. Harry Truman, you want an example of a cover-up, as a senator who worked on budget committees, and then as vice president, he did not know about the Manhattan Project to develop nuclear weapons. It took 13 days after President Roosevelt died before he was briefed. And he had to make the decision whether we should use an atomic bomb or not. There's an example of cover-up. Now, Truman provided leadership, no question. And I talked to somebody who worked for him every single day that he was in the White House, and Truman was very security conscious. This guy walked in when Truman was dressing down a senator for being careless. But he provided leadership. He didn't shilly-shally around. He knew where he stood. He insisted on desegregation of the Army, for example, when there were a lot of people who didn't think that was a good idea, you know. So what is needed is leadership. Another example, Admiral Hyman Rickover developed the nuclear submarine, the nuclear fleet. And there are all kinds of people who say, why do you want a submarine, build a big nuclear-powered battleship or an aircraft carrier? He built a submarine. And people don't realize submarines used to be boats that could go underwater for a day or so, and then they had to surface because they needed oxygen for the engines. Nuclear submarine goes around the world underwater without surfacing. Takes periscope leave when they go by Hawaii to see what's going on out there. They built nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, can operate for 18 years without refueling. That's leadership. We haven't had that. I worked on nuclear airplanes. We needed leadership and didn't have any. The program was canceled. Nuclear rockets, we needed leadership, didn't have it, program was canceled. I worked on more programs like that, at least half a dozen. And that's what's sad. Where are the Rickovers of today? And I'd like to find some more, you know. Maybe we don't give enough attention to the guys who can say, this is what we're going to do, let's do it. And so I'm waiting for those guys. But, you know, people don't realize how big the programs were that got canceled. I mean, I worked on a small one, aircraft nuclear propulsion, 1958, General Electric. We spent $100 million that year. Employed 3,500 people full-time, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. How many people know about the program? Darn few. And it wasn't even a black budget program. So there are a lot of these, when the Cold War was going, hey, I got an idea, let's spend the money because we'll beat the Russians, you know. Whether the idea was any good wasn't the point, wasn't what mattered. So I think we need to recognize somebody's got to be looking at the big picture. Not what's good for the party or for the country, but what's good for the planet. And there's not many of us doing that. And we can talk about saving the planet and global warming and all this kind of stuff. We need to look at things much more carefully. For example, much of the global warming literature is nonsense. What affects the temperature is not evil CO2. Every plant needs CO2. How can you call it a pollutant, for goodness sakes? There are other things going on, like what's happening at the sun. And surprising as it may seem, solar storms trigger temperature change down here. They also trigger psychological episodes down here. It's a chapter in my book, Science Was Wrong. A guy named Dr. Becker worked for the, it's kind of funny, he worked for the Veterans Administration Hospital in Syracuse, New York. And he did a lot of looking, and he was surprised that you could enhance healing, broken bones and stuff with electricity. Which is kind of neat. If it isn't healing, you'd like to have it heal. What he found, he did awful lot of work, found that you could correlate admissions to mental hospitals with changes in the Earth's electric field. Weird as that may sound. And then they set up a program where permanent inhabitants of insane asylums, if you will, the nurses wrote out evaluations on a 6-hour basis every 6 hours, good, bad, indifferent, whatever it was. Very good correlation with changes in the Earth's electric and magnetic fields, which is quite remarkable. And he also found, well, he went along, there was another guy named Nelson. His job was to predict when RCA would have to use cables for the transmission of broadcasting signals instead of radio. It was expensive. Much rather broadcast from an antenna. But if the conditions weren't right, you wouldn't go anywhere, too much static. Nelson's job was to figure out when they could get by broadcasting as opposed to using cable, expensive cable. And he did it by relating the conditions to the positions of Jupiter primarily and Saturn, which sounds crazy as hell. You're talking astrology. Well, as it happens, the center of gravity of the sun is not, of the solar system, is not in the middle of the sun most of the time, because when, say, Jupiter and Saturn are on one side of the sun, that moves the center of gravity, everything rotating around, to that side. Well, when the center of gravity moves, you trigger solar storms. Solar storms influence the planet, the atmosphere, the electric levels down here. We've had big power blackouts because of those solar storms on occasion. So what I'm saying is we need to look around outside ourselves, not have our egos get in the way. I don't know how that could happen, so it couldn't happen. Well, that's not the real world. The chemtrail program is an interesting example of things being done that nobody is being told about that can have correlates, people's health. You know, we tend to forget that not everybody is equally sensitive to any stimulus you mention, whether it's radiation. There's a process called hormesis, where a little is damaging and a little is beneficial and a lot is damaging. And the question is, where's that point? 2 aspirin is fine for a headache, but 30 will probably kill you. So this is true for radiation. People have different sensitivity. And all these chemicals that come in around from chemtrails and all other things that we're putting out there, some people are going to be more affected than others. That's the way we are. You can see it in people who treat patients with radiation to cure cancer. Some people get sick at the lowest dose, and some people it doesn't bother them at all. You have to take into account that we're all different. And so just the fact that 98% of the people aren't bothered isn't good enough, really. You know, if you said, well, I'll poison the other 2%, it doesn't matter, it's just a small amount. You know, we have to be more aware of that. And one of the dangers of secrecy is we're not told about things that can do us damage. And you'd be very unhappy if a doctor didn't bother to tell you, oh, this medicine I prescribed for you, by the way, you better watch out for A, B, C, and D, because some people are badly affected by it. Well, it's true in all kinds of things in our environment, whether it's genetically modified grain or stuff like that. There's all kinds of things. We're playing God. We haven't earned the role yet, as far as I'm concerned. You know, I think it is possible for us to reverse a lot of the damage that's been done if we think about it carefully, if we put some effort into it. Problem on this planet is we're spending $1 trillion a year on things military. Boy, would that have benefit in a whole bunch of areas, not just curing disease, but getting rid of the bad effects of some of the environmental things. Look how much good it would do if there was easier birth control available in many parts of the planet. That's not that expensive, but it would sure be a benefit if a woman didn't have to worry about her kid's starving because she's bringing another one into the world. And there are means of helping. we're not using them. We're using our smarts in the wrong directions, I'm afraid. And so I think there's hope, but it means recognition that we've got to change our ways. That's where the difficulty is. I hope I live long enough to see some of those.
So if we go back and we look really fundamentally at the system that we call the current banking system, we have to realize that the current banking system actually ended probably in 1971. And what we're doing right now is we're playing out the last elements of a system that really did fail. And the reason why I say that is because if you go back and you look at the 30-year bond, which is in fact the fundamentals of our current economic system, the 30-year bond, when it was first structured in 1913, when the Fed was established, that 30-year bond was specifically linked to the life expectancy of the average laborer in the United States. And people forget that 30 years is not a natural history number, it's not a metaphysical history number. 30 years is actually a real number that came from the actuarial life expectancy of a laborer at the turn of the last century. And the reason why the 30-year bond was established is because life insurers were selling life insurance policies that had a maturity, mysteriously, on your death. And the amazing thing is the maturity of the policy actually matched your death less a few months. The way in which you robbed humanity was actually sell them life insurance, which you knew they would not renew on the year that they died. And that's the reason why the life insurance model was actually structured the way it was. And it's the reason why when you go back and look at the investigations that preceded the establishment of the Federal Reserve, you actually see that in those investigations, the people who were framing the duration of the Treasury notes were life insurance companies. And those life insurance companies needed 30-year duration assets. Now, it turns out 30-year duration assets only work if you have life insurers who actually backstop the mortality of the people that are being insured. And so what you have is this insidious cycle. And the problem that has happened, and lo and behold, it's happened on 3 punctuated moments, oddly enough. We had the Great Depression, which was actually one of those moments, which actually led to the Bretton Woods Accords. And if you go back and look at the Bretton Woods Accords, the reason why we established the dollar as the hegemonic currency in Bretton Woods, we established it because we were about to default on the first 30-year note. The next 30-year note was the Nixon administration, 1971, when we defaulted on the gold standard, which is actually when France went to actually redeem the gold standard. We went and said, guess what? We're not in the gold standard anymore, and we defaulted a second time. The third default was 2001. Not mysteriously, the day before 9/11, 9/10/2001, there was actually a public pronouncement that there was a missing $2 trillion of liquidity in the United States government. That missing liquidity was identified, of all things, by Donald Rumsfeld. Now, you wouldn't expect a defense executive inside of the executive branch of the government to be the one that announces the default, but that happened, and it happened publicly, and then quite mysteriously, the day after, a new cover story was born. So the third default was actually a very interesting one, because rather than restarting a 30-year clock, it started a shorter duration clock. The reason why 2008 was significant is because 2008 was actually the maturation of the shortening duration of the treasuries being held by banks. And interestingly, rather than going into a 30-year cycle, we went into a blended 5- and 10-year cycle, and that's the reason why 2008 is so important. Because the reason why we actually created, first of all, second mortgages, which then were sold into non-agency mortgage-backed securities, which is what led to the balloon that ultimately popped in 2008. The reason why we did that is because the Fed was trying to de-lever itself, and by going through a process of doing that, it actually created the illusion of cheap money. The illusion of cheap money led to the illusion of liquidity. The illusion of liquidity led to the expansion of the collateralized mortgage obligations, collateralized debt structures, including the most famous credit default swaps, where when we got to 2006 and 2007, we were actually already twice the GDP of the United States and Europe combined. By 2008, the bets against humanity, credit default swaps, had actually become 5 times the global GDP. In other words, our bets that humanity was not going to pay its bills were 5 times greater than the sum total of all of the earning potential of the world. Now, you stop and think for a moment. When did the banking system fail? Well, the banking system probably failed at Bretton Woods. I'd like to point out, for people who actually are aware, that if you go back and look at the most audacious piece of social media in the 1960s, you will note that in the villains in the James Bond movies, Ian Fleming's James Bond movies, if you go back and you ask yourself, the uber rich guy who was trying to take over the world in every one of those movies, what did he have? Did he have dollars in his pocket? No. And this is, remember, in the 1960s, and it's a UK author. It's really important to understand this. In the 1960s, and this is only 20 years after Bretton Woods, the uber villain had Deutsche Marks. That's an amazing recognition that even in the 1960s and 1970s, it was the German mark. It was not the US dollar. It was associated with wealth. And see, the funny thing is we tell ourselves the OPEC associated and sanctioned story, which is that the dollar has always been the hegemonic currency. The fact of the matter is it never has been. And if it weren't for the oil trade, the dollar would not have hegemony. As a matter of fact, if you go back and look at what toppled the Shah in 1979, you go back and look at what toppled all of these other despot leaders in oil-rich countries, you'll find out that the guys that got toppled were the ones that didn't play ball with the dollar hegemony, and the ones that didn't get toppled were the ones that did play ball. That's a very simple admission that the US dollar actually did not fulfill the promise that it tried to fulfill in Bretton Woods. So this idea of a global banking system, the idea of a global currency denominated system, all of that is an illusion propped up on one cartel, and that's OPEC. You take OPEC out of the system, there's no cartel. Now, it turns out that the reason why you have in 1970s this wonderful liberation of the relationship between the United States and China, you'll all recall Nixon's ping-pong diplomacy. The real reason why Nixon did that is because he actually needed somebody to buy our debt. And it's funny that the US president actually turned to then the most repressive communist country to actually figure out how to stabilize the capitalist banking system in the United States. So what's fascinating is you have the Nixon administration in 1971 deciding that it needs to figure out who can buy our debt, because our system, the capitalist system, the one that's, remember, the one that's working, right? The fabulous capitalist system that's working, the fabulous banking system that's working, actually isn't working. And so what we do is we turn, of all places, to the Chinese. And we turn to the Chinese to buy our debt. And what you see in 1972, 1974, 1976 is the liberalization of the legality of foreign interests buying our debt, because it turns out that we had to change the law to admit that our financial system wasn't working. And it turns out that the only people who would buy what we were selling, which is our bad debt, were the Chinese. So when I'm asked whether the banking system collapsed in 2008, I sit there going, you know, you're off by something like almost 35 to 40 years. It really collapsed in the 70s. That's when we finally admitted that it didn't work. And the only people we could coerce into making it preserve the illusion of working was the largest, most repressive communist regime in the world. That's when we actually figured out the banking system wasn't working. And the only reason why we've been able to preserve the illusion that it's working is with entities like Goldman Sachs and others who have decided to actually become the investment bankers to the resource industry. And by that I mean energy and metals, where Goldman Sachs has gone around the world and has decided to take its position as the investment banker to the Chinese state more often than anybody else. Because if you actually go back and look at the transactions that Goldman Sachs advises, coal deals in Mongolia, energy and metals deals in Pacific and Southeast Asia, you go back and look at who's behind those things, and it turns out that the investment bankers to the rich and famous, in fact, are actually not investment bankers to the rich and famous. They are the agencies of credit provision for the State Council of China, because the State Council of China realized well into its debt purchasing fiasco that that was a bad bet. They were buying U.S. Treasuries, and they found out midway through their purchases in the 80s and into the early 90s that we actually weren't going to pay them back. So what they did going up into the latter 2000s is they started saying, let's actually play the game that the U.S. played. And what did they do? This is the part that just cracks me up. During the Bush administration, there was a very significant amount of saber rattling with Iran. Now, it turns out that if you go back and look, who was actually in Iran at the time building infrastructure for nuclear, for energy, for all kinds of oil extraction, for natural gas extraction, for the trans-Iranian, trans-Central Asian pipelines, go back and look at who's financing those. And it turns out it was the Chinese that were financing them. But guess what they were using to secure the financing for those transactions? They were using U.S. Treasuries. So at the very same time that the Bush administration was telling the world that we hated Iran, that we weren't going to support Iran, we weren't going to do anything to help Iran, we hated the regime, we were all about taking the regime down, at the same time that was happening, our U.S. Treasuries were bankrolling the development of allegedly our archenemy. Now, the problem with that cover story is self-evident. It's actually a bad cover story, but it also has the disadvantage of being so pathologically treasonous when you are actually evoking this mass illusion on the one hand that says that we have this enemy which justifies all kinds of militarization and so forth, and on the other hand you have a system that's actually running around the world telling itself that this capitalist regime, this capitalist banking system is actually working. And the fact of the matter is it wasn't working. Now, the worst part about that is you actually have this kind of schizophrenia, which if you say it more frequently, or at least as frequently as the Bush administration liked to say it, you say it often enough, people actually start believing you. And so if you really look at the fundamental underpinnings of 2008 and allegedly the collapse of 2008, it had nothing to do with the collapse. It had everything to do with debt maturities that actually were in fact defaulted. And the fact is that it was the CDS market and the collateralized mortgage market that collapsed. It was not banks that failed. It was not a global financial crisis. It was actually a crisis when finally people pressed on the system and found out that the emperor had no clothes. But the emperor hadn't had any clothes for a long time. This emperor had been naked since 1971. And the fact that his stuff was flipping around in the wind in 2008 was not a banking collapse or a financial crisis in 2008. The problem was actually in 1971 when we decided to default the integrity of our capital system, and we decided that it was better and more expedient to actually sell out and push the ball down the road and continue to push the ball down the road until it finally came back to bite us. Now, in 2008, we allegedly had this giant reset. And we all recall, this is when banks were going to learn how to be better people, the investment banks were going to learn how to be better people, the SEC was going to do a better job of regulating the market, the Fed and the OCC and the FDIC were going to do a better job regulating banks. And guess what? They didn't. And I don't mean they didn't really well. I mean, they didn't. If you look at the period from 2008 to 2012, you'll notice a very interesting thing. The United States government decided it was patriotic to encourage citizens to actually put more cash into banks. So 2008, when we were supposed to actually have the encouragement of the United States deposits, in other words, U.S. depositors coming back and saying, hey, you know what? This banking system is really good. We have to support it. What in fact happened was the U.S. government decided to double the insured limit of deposits. If you go back and you look at the bank windows that you used to walk into, you'll notice that it said all deposits in this bank are actually insured up to $100,000. By fiat, we actually doubled it and then added another $50,000 onto that, so that now all of a sudden, mysteriously, those deposits were insured up to $250,000. But
What was fascinating is if you actually went back and looked and you said, what does the FDIC stand for? Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. A deposit insurance corporation would make you think, if you just heard those words, that your deposits were insured. Which would be a lovely thing if in fact it was true. But it turns out that your deposits aren't insured. And so the beautiful giant swindle of the 2000s was the recognition that all of a sudden the United States depositors, those people who were suddenly spendthrift and decided to go ahead and start saving, actually were putting in their money into illiquid organizations. And lo and behold, the deposits they were told were insured actually weren't. The FDIC's annual report came out and said that they were grossly underfunded. And so what did they do? They actually said they were going to raise premiums, which is what an insurance company does when it actually knows that it's got a problem. But it turns out that they decided to raise premiums in a very interesting way. You could go to your banks, that your FDIC insured banks, and you could actually sit down with your bank and, as the FDIC, negotiate with them what their premiums should be over the next 5 years. And if they prepaid that, they would pay less. Now, you and I actually can start to think about that and start realizing, well, hold on a second. If they need more money, like twice as much money to insure twice as much insurable, which is what the logical extrapolation of going from $100,000 to $250,000 would be, you would expect that the insurance company would actually benefit from getting at least twice as large a premium, maybe 250% the premium that they used to collect. That's not what happened. They actually collected less premium per unit of insured value, and lo and behold, the way they invested that premium is with assets issued by the United States Treasury. So your deposits are insured by an illiquid asset. It was a great way to co-opt the United States depositors into actually underwriting the illiquidity of the banking system. And every single person that put any dollar into an FDIC insured institution actually became the proud beneficiary of the faith and credit of the United States government. Now, I don't know how that sits with you, but I will tell you what. 2012, that giant moment in time when we were supposed to actually encounter this great awakening and this great illumination, and when we the people were going to finally wake up to the fact that it was time for us to change, unfortunately came and went without the American people or the global citizens to actually realize that not only they had been swindled through the period of time from 2001 to 2008, but worse than that, they actually had been participating in their own complicit demise. So when you sit there and say, well, 2012, did a great shift happen, or did the shift hit the fan? The fact of the matter is very simple. We didn't read the fine print. We actually propped up our own undoing. And now, we the people have an obligation to wake up. We the people have to realize that we can't blame somebody else for this. This is not some nefarious conspiracy of 14 families that come from the Knights Templar and kind of figure out a way to squirrel away golden jewels in some Nicolas Cage movie. That's not the problem. The problem is actually staring us in the mirror every morning when we wake up. And when we go through the world thinking, this is too complicated for me to understand. Let me lay it out for you really simple. It's not too complicated. You have had your pocket picked. And then you've been asked to pay the pickpocket his cab fare to take your money away from you. And then you've been asked to make sure that that pickpocket who has taken your money away from you is given safe passage to a place where you can never get your money back. There it is, Plain English. That's what's happened. And lest you think that I'm some sort of angel of doom and gloom, think again. The fact of the matter is this system hasn't been working. It didn't work 100 years ago when it was constructed, when the Federal Reserve, over the objections of the American people, actually was formed. It didn't work then. And this 100-year experiment has failed. And we, the people, have an opportunity to actually start a new experiment. So in the mid-2000s, the State Council of China, as part of the ongoing inquiry to understand precisely what was happening in the US economy and the European economy, realized that there were two fundamental problems. One was that the European currency, the euro, was actually quite unstable. And the US resolve to actually honor its treasury obligations was also unstable. And as a result, through the mid-2000s, going up into 2007, the State Council started looking internally at its assets and asking the question, is a dollar treasury value really a dollar anymore? In the last few years, the government of China has officially announced that it is devaluing its treasury holdings. And it has done so by 30%, meaning that their belief that they're going to get paid at par, meaning a dollar for a dollar, is actually reduced. So they actually believe every dollar that they've invested is now worth 70 cents. Now, if we as a country in the United States had decided that we disagree with that, one of the things we could do is we could actually go back and say, hey, China, you've just marked down these assets and we think they're worth a dollar, you think they're worth 70 cents, so we'll give you 85 cents for them. But we didn't do that. In fact, we let that markdown happen and did nothing to stop it. In fact, we encouraged the Chinese to buy shorter duration treasuries, things that had less maturity, less long duration value. That's what we encouraged them to do. So we actually let that markdown happen and we paid no attention to that. The other thing we let the Chinese do is use the US treasuries as a backing to actually support euro-denominated contracts. In other words, our collateral, that thing called the United States Treasury, was actually being used as collateral against the financing for euro-denominated contracts. Now that's a brilliant move, by the way. It's a great way to actually have your cake and eat it too. And it turns out that that led to a lot of the large infrastructure projects, things like high-speed rail, things like water and civil infrastructure, all these kinds of projects. What the Chinese did was brilliant. They actually used US-denominated transactions, took euro contracts in, and actually essentially hedged their dollar exposure by getting euro value. It was a brilliant move. During that same time, and those of you who are aware of what was happening in the World Trade Organization will realize that the Doha round of negotiations for the WTO had been collapsed for quite a while. And during that time, a lot of finance ministers, as well as heads of state of the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the other 60 plus non-aligned movement countries out of the WTO were starting to get together and having conversations and said maybe, just maybe, the United States dollar and the euro may not come back to their hegemonic position. And as a result, they started exploring their alternatives. The astute watcher of this information will actually go back and look at the media and realize that these things were announced. Things like the relationship with the Chinese and the Singaporeans, the Chinese and the Japanese, the Chinese and others, who actually started forming currency alliances and credit alliances outside of the G20. And it turns out that if you look in the historical record over the last 4 years, you see the emergence of an entire new banking regime, including BNDES, the largest development bank in Brazil, which happens to have more assets than the World Bank. And if you look at BNDES in Brazil, and if you look at the development banks of China, you look at the development banks in India, you look at the development banks in the rest of the BRIC and non-aligned countries, you realize that they already out-asset the World Bank. They already out-liquefy things like the IMF. And so what's happened is the emergence of cooperative agreements between the BRICS countries at a level that is unprecedented in history. Now, what that means is that they are actually going back and saying, we fundamentally don't believe that Bretton Woods, the OPEC hegemony of the dollar, is coming back. And we fundamentally don't have confidence that the euro is actually fundamentally stable to count on as a core global currency. But worse than that, for those of us living in debt-denominated currency markets, is that the Chinese, unlike us, the Brazilians, unlike us, Indians, unlike us, actually like the idea of asset-backed currencies. And as a result, the emerging new reality is going to be an emerging reality that includes energy as a reserve, minerals as a reserve, and the most controversial one is potable water. Those three things as a reserve basis, if you will, a basket of assets, which actually buoy the currency, are things that are in fact not only theoretically in the works, but they're actually in the works. And not surprisingly, Gulf states countries, countries that actually are the oil producers, are actually participating in that side of the equation. They already have convinced themselves that the era of the OPEC Bretton Woods dollar hegemony is over. And we in the United States and we in Europe are the last ones to pick up on this. The bad news is that by the time we do pick up on that, the ability for those countries and the BRICS countries and the non-aligned movement countries to actually become their own consumers actually is going to take away the capacity for us to actually respond. Because historically we've used the balance of trade to respond. But it turns out that when you have a couple billion people who are now consumers in the growing middle class at that new lower middle class range, which happens to be the constituents of a large population of the BRICS countries, you actually find out that those consumers will in fact be fully satisfied with the production that comes out of those countries. And all of a sudden having 300 million American consumers is actually not interesting when you have 1 billion Chinese consumers, or you have 800 million Indian consumers. And lo and behold, our ability to actually adapt and adjust is going to be directly linked to our capacity to envision a future where we have to cooperate rather than mandate our economic systems on the rest of the world.
We want our planet back. It's been going on too long. Everyone is waking up, and the animals are strong. Nature needs rebounding, so we're wishing on the stars. I'm just a kid at heart, and that is where we start. Who's in charge here? Who's in charge here? Let's do it differently. It's sickening all the people, and it's killing all the trees. It's falling in our eyes, and it's getting harder to see the beauty that is our world and the freedom to be free. it's landing in the water. We know it's in the air. It's time for you and me to show we care. Say no to GMOs hiding in our food, and no to fluoride in our water too. Who's in charge here? Who's in charge here? Let's save this family and do what's right for Earth and you and me. Step into the new way, where we live in harmony. No more war, no more fracking. We are free. Who's in charge here? Who's in charge? Let's do it differently. Sickening all the people, and it's killing all the trees. It's falling in our eyes, and it's getting harder to see the beauty that is our world and the freedom to be free. We got our planet back. It went on far too long, and now everybody woke up and the animals stayed strong. Nature is rebounding and we're working with the stars. We have free energy. Oh, look at who we are. We're in charge here, and we love this family. All of the birds, the whales, and the ETs. We are free. We want our planet back. It's been going